All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We may have a few folks join a little bit later, but welcome everyone. This is the REBA Institute's webinar on how companies can act now to procure lower carbon building materials. Really excited to have everyone here today. My name is Jen Snook, and I'm a manager for the REBA Institute's program, Decarbonizing Industrial Supply Chain Energy. So today we have three fantastic panelists speaking with us, and we're going to leave time at the end for Q&A. So if any questions arise in the course of the presentations, feel free to jot them down to yourself for later, or you can also submit them in the course of the presentations using the little Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we will get to them at the end of the presentations. So I will introduce our panelists now. We have three wonderful women with us today. So first we have Meghan Lewis, who is a senior researcher at the Carbon Leadership Forum, where she leads research on procurement of low carbon built materials and how public and private embodied carbon policy can support the rapid decarbonization of building materials and construction. Previously to joining Carbon Leadership Forum, Meghan was head of global energy and sustainability at WeWork, where she also launched the Supply Chain Sustainability Program in 2018. Meghan gained her architectural license while practicing at Methuen in Seattle, where she worked on a range of project types and spearheaded internal efforts to integrate LCA and low carbon material selection into the design process. Next, we'll hear from Stacy Smedley, who has a Bachelor of Arts in Architecture from the University of Washington and over 18 years in the architecture and construction professions. Her resume includes the first Lead for Homes Platinum certified project in Washington State, as well as the first project in the world to be certified under Living Building version 2.0 standards. Stacy has led sustainability initiatives and is considered a subject matter expert on LEED, Living Building Challenge, and carbon emissions associated with buildings and construction. In her role as executive director of that newly established nonprofit Building Transparency, Stacy leads the continued management and development of the free, open access, embodied carbon and construction calculator tool, which we'll talk about a little bit later, Ec3, and works to integrate and engage the building industry on actionably reducing embodied carbon emissions of building materials. And then last but not least, we'll hear from Katie Ross, who leads sustainability for Microsoft's real estate portfolio and is responsible for developing and implementing sustainability strategies for their offices around the world. Katie's career has been dedicated to the adoption of high-performance, healthy, sustainable buildings. She oversees sustainability strategy for Microsoft's new campuses, including Puget Sound, Israel, and Silicon Valley, and works with global sites to implement operational best practices. She prides herself on being a sustainability translator, ensuring that Microsoft's employees and the public understand the nuances and importance of sustainability topics. So like I said, I'm really excited to have these three women with us today. And now I will hand it off to Meghan.
All right. Okay, looks like I have control of the screen. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. I'm excited to be joining this panel. As Jen mentioned, I had some experience at WeWork, and during that time, I really got to appreciate REBA as a community, and I'm really excited to be able to present to this group today. I'm going to start us off with a high-level view of embodied carbon and the recent growth in policy landscape to frame the deeper dives that Stacy and Katie are going to share afterwards. And just starting off a little bit about the Carbon Leadership Forum. The CLF was founded in 2009 to pioneer research, create resources, incubate tools and initiatives, and foster collaboration among our growing network of over 5,000 architects, engineers, contractors, manufacturers, building owners, and policymakers interested in taking steps to decarbonize the built environment. Our mission is to accelerate the transformation of the building sector to radically reduce the embodied carbon in building materials and construction through collective action. There we go. The past 10 years of work would not have been possible without our sponsors. I think the breadth of the organizations here also speaks to the collaboration that's needed across the building sector to achieve radical reductions in embodied carbon. So to get us started today, I'm just going to start off with what is embodied carbon, since we'll be referring to it a lot. So embodied carbon refers to the greenhouse gas emissions arising from the manufacturing, installation, maintenance, and disposal of building materials used in the construction of buildings, roads, and other infrastructure. These emissions can be calculated and added up across a product's life cycle and reported as global warming potential in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. So in contrast, you have operational carbon emissions during the use phase of a building. And here you can also see the terms cradle to gate and cradle to grave, which you may have heard in reference to a product's life cycle. So when we're thinking about supply chain emissions, which is what we're focusing on today, we often also talk about just the cradle to gate emissions. But cradle to grave would be talking about the installation, repair, demolition, and waste processing and transport, as well as the upfront embodied carbon impacts. And here I'm just mapping out how that relates to scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions in terms of corporate carbon accounting. So for operational carbon, you can see scope 1 and 2 emissions, as you would expect. And then embodied carbon really comes in with scope 3, so the upstream and downstream scope 3 emissions. And particularly here, so I've included some of the greenhouse gas protocol definitions here, but emissions from procured products is really what we're talking about with embodied carbon. So why are we talking about embodied carbon? So I think for at a global scale, I can share, how significant those impacts are. But I think also for companies, it's important to understand that scope 3 emissions are significant. This diagram is from a CDP supply chain report that based on the growing data that they have from companies that report. Supply chain emissions are typically 5.5 times greater than scope 1 and 2 emissions for a company, which really means that there's a significant opportunity for companies to have a broader impact than they're even having when they're addressing their scope 1 and 2 emissions. Oh. There we go. And at the global scale, we know that at least 11% of energy-related carbon emissions are embodied carbon resulting from the production of building materials. And that really is just talking about steel and cement primarily is what that data is based on. So when you expand out and think about other high impact building materials, that number is actually likely larger. But I think what this diagram also shows is that building materials are this really important intersection of industrial sector emissions, which are really difficult to abate, and then the building sector emissions that we typically think of in terms of operations. And so this is also an exciting opportunity because it's a way for the building sector to play this really important role in reducing industrial emissions, which have been really hard to reduce in the past. And another reason that addressing embodied carbon now is really important is because of this sort of the time value of carbon. So addressing this is really urgent. You can see in this graphic here, so I'll dive into this a little more. So on the far left here is the upfront embodied carbon and that's when you build a building. So let's say this is, if this were 2020, although I know it's 2021 now, it's still a nice round number to work with. So in the first year, or before that building is even open, all of that carbon is being locked into place. And that's what we think of when we think of embodied carbon, and that is before even day one where you're turning the lights on. And you can see it's quite significant. And it's also, there's no opportunity to reduce that over time. And the blue is the operational carbon, which through efforts like energy efficiency, through renewable energy procurement, can be reduced over time. And because of that, what we see is that by 2030, 67% of the impact of a typical, of a high performance building is going to be from embodied carbon rather than operational. And by 2050, that's slightly smaller, it's 56%, but it's still a really significant opportunity for reductions when we think about an individual building that's being constructed. And its urgency is also increased even more when you consider the timescales at which investments are made for heavy industry infrastructure. So for something like a cement or a steel plant, that's going on 30 to 50-year cycles of when they upgrade or renovate their factories. It's really important for them to get a clear signal now from the public sector and the private sector that low carbon material manufacturing is important, and it's something that they should be investing in now. The good news is that there's a growing landscape of public and private sector initiatives that are rising to meet this challenge. So I'm going to dive in a lot more into the government regulation and incentive side, but just highlighting here some of what we're seeing. So green building certifications like BREEAM, LEED, Living Building Challenge, Zero Carbon certification, those all include embodied carbon requirements or credits. And then in terms of corporate sustainability and scope 3 emissions tracking through TCFD, GRESB, CDP supply chain, there's growing appreciation for supply chain emissions. And then also in the building industry, there's a growing number of voluntary commitments. So SC 2050, for example, is a commitment for structural engineering firms that want to pledge to reduce embodied carbon on their projects. There's other pledges, including the 2030 challenge for embodied carbon. So just sort of the growing momentum that we're seeing around taking action. And then diving a little more into the public sector policy that we're seeing, it's really exploded in the last few years. And this is what I spend a lot of my time on at the Carbon Leadership Forum, is just tracking these efforts and providing technical support to policymakers that are developing these. And in the US, just in this year alone, there's been 6 states that have introduced a procurement bill focused on embodied carbon. There's a federal program proposed right now that was introduced first in 2019, and both the House and then in the Senate in 2018, that's still being developed. And then the California, which is the first state to pass an embodied carbon policy, referred to as the Buy Clean California Act, published the first global warming potential limits on products, meaning that now steel, insulation, and glass that are procured for state of California projects have to be below certain carbon footprint thresholds. And then at the local level, we see a huge amount of action. It tends to differ a little bit in scope, so less focus on procurement policy and more on local integrating embodied carbon into climate action plans, city zoning and land use policies, and the green building incentive programs. So for example, Seattle has a priority green expedited program that now, if you provide embodied carbon data on building materials, that's a requirement for getting that priority expedited permitting. And then, of course, a large number of cities also tackle embodied carbon through reducing materials into landfill through building reuse and material salvage. And then on codes, the first low carbon code was passed in 2019 in Marin County, and conversations are happening currently to provide model language related to embodied carbon for ASHRAE 189.1, and there are conversations happening in a number of the states that are also talking about state policy related to embodied carbon to get that integrated into state energy codes or building codes. And I think, the state leadership is really important for a number of reasons. So first of all, because states have a really large procurement footprint. And so there's a huge opportunity with these policies, which I apologize, I'm going to talk more about the details of these state procurement policies later. But it's a really important opportunity to directly reduce the emissions on state projects. But it also is, what we're seeing is a lot of different versions of these policies that could be implemented at the federal level that are being tested out by the states. And you can see here on the right a little more details on just the sheer number of policies that are being put forward. Some, and most in this year, but some states they're on, their second or third time that they're proposing Buy Clean. And I think that really just reinforces the message that these policies are being integrated at the state and then soon to be likely at the federal level. And so it's only a matter of time before these requirements are going to be more and more common, which is really exciting because it just makes it easier for public sector, or for the private sector to build on that momentum, because they'll be working with architects, engineers, contractors who are working also on state projects or federal projects and have the experience of fulfilling these requirements. So now I'm going to dive more into what it actually looks like to develop a policy to reduce embodied carbon. So when we think about opportunities for reducing embodied carbon, there's sort of 3 stages that also align with the processes of designing and constructing a building. So before you even begin building a building is the largest opportunity for reducing embodied carbon, because you can think about things like, do we need to build it all? Can we reuse an existing building? Can we build a smaller footprint building? And then some things also related to just using less materials, like using salvage materials or establishing design for disassembly requirements. These are all things that are easier to integrate before building design starts. And owners and tenants play a really key role in including these requirements in owner project requirements. In a brief, the earlier that these that embodied carbon as a goal is included in a project, the larger the reductions are going to be. And so this is a really important time to integrate this into a project. And then moving into the design phase, where we're focusing more on optimizing the design of the building, optimizing the systems that are being chosen. And this is really where architects and engineers in particular are playing a role in informing the reductions for embodied carbon. So this looks like material efficiency. So can you design a more efficient structure that uses less material? Can the shape of the building impacts the amount of embodied carbon in materials, as well as, you know, what system should you use? Should it be a concrete structure? Should it be a mass timber structure? Those are decisions that can be made at this stage that also have a huge impact on what the opportunity is for reducing carbon. And then at the last, we have optimizing procurement. And this is where there's exciting new, this was a little more difficult to do until recently. And now, which Stacy's going to dive into, the Ec3 tool, I think really unlocks a lot of opportunities for focusing on procurement, as well as using EPDs. And at this stage, rather than saying, are you going to use concrete? Are you going to use wood? Basically, any material can be better. And so this is focusing more on, okay, I'm going to use concrete. I'm going to use the best possible, or the lowest possible carbon concrete that is available, looking at specific products and specific manufacturers. And so at each stage, you're carrying through different opportunities to maximize overall in the project. And at the bottom here, you can also see how these sort of line up with different tools that are available, as well as different policy levers. So, you know, early in the stage, it's more rules of thumb. And then moving into design, there are building scale tools called whole building lifecycle assessment. And then moving into procurement, there's a tool called environmental product declaration, which is like a nutrition label for a building material that can be used to evaluate the carbon footprint of a specific material rather than a theoretical system, sort of with using whole building LCA tools. And then on the policy side, similarly, there are different policies that are levers for reducing these different aspects of embodied carbon. And I think it's important so thinking more from the point of view of a company, I think performance-based policies are really key for allowing for, you know, there are a number of different strategies, the ones we just discussed, but also just thinking about a specific material, there are a lot of different ways that you can drive down the carbon of a specific material. So rather than saying we want carbon, or we want a material manufactured in this way, using performance-based policies allows for others to figure out what that best way is. And companies can focus on just building the buildings that they want to build. And so performance-based policies there's a building scale to that, as well as a material scale. We're going to focus on the material approach today, which is to collect carbon footprint data for these materials, and then to say what the baseline of that is. So what is that material typically? What's the footprint now? And then how are we going to reduce that over time? And then what that does is that for a material approach, this is going to incentivize manufacturers to invest in clean manufacturing practices. And it's really key for low carbon technology adoption, particularly for products mentioned that take longer time to invest in changes. And then for a building approach, which would rely on whole building lifecycle assessment, it's going to incentivize different stakeholders, so focusing on more on the architects and engineers and designing a lower carbon building. These are both really important and complementary approaches, so I just want to highlight that before we continue to focus primarily on the material approach. And we developed this framework just to understand the growing policy landscape, so particularly procurement policies, what the key components are, and also some things to keep in mind developing a policy for a company as well as for a state agency. So there are really 5 key components. The first one is scope. So what materials are included, what projects. Second is what data is collected. Third, are there standards? Are there, is there a baseline and reduction targets that a product has to be below? Are there incentives? For example, bid incentives to, scoring carbon as well as cost in the bid, and then giving preference to suppliers who have a better carbon score. And then last, compliance. So, at what point are documents collected? Who is responsible for leading that? And with just thinking about getting started, a scope starting with a few high impact materials where you spend the most money is a great place to start. So that's why you see a lot of states focusing on structure, thinking about, concrete, steel, wood, for example, in the current bill in Washington is looking at those three materials. They are a large opportunity for embodied carbon reductions. They're a large amount of money, a large volume of materials. It's a great place to start. If you're a tenant, that's going to look different. That would be wallboard, carpet, ceiling tile. It depends on what kind of building, what kind of project you're looking on, that you're working on. And there are ways to identify what those hotspots are for a company. So you can, use existing policies, an example, or you could do a sort of hotspot analysis using a whole building life cycle assessment, or just rely on sort of industry standards of understanding what data is available and where does it make sense to get started. One thing that's really great is that all of these policies are requiring transparency in terms of data in form of an EPD. And so there's really a lot of industry alignment around EPDs are the tool for collecting this data. And then in terms of standards incentives, these can be phased in over time. We've seen that at the public as well as on the private side. So setting emissions reductions for emission reductions targets for materials where there's already enough data is great, and that guarantees that you're going to be able to reduce carbon on projects. For other materials where there's not as much data, it's completely fine to just start with disclosure and then over time add in reduction requirements or reduction. Yeah, just before passing it off to Stacy, I'm just going to talk a little bit about EPDs to make sure we cover the topics there for those of you who are less familiar. So an environmental product declaration is a third-party verified disclosure of a material's environmental impact. So it includes the global warming potential, which is what we talk about when we talk about the carbon footprint. It also includes a number of other environmental impacts. These are based on international standards. So it's based on a series of ISO standards. So these are also used in Europe and other parts of the world. Manufacturers are already using these for disclosing and reporting supply chain impacts. And I think that is, it's incredibly difficult to collect supply chain emissions data from a large number of suppliers. And so one of the things that's unique about EPDs that makes them so powerful as a tool is because they capture supply chain impacts, even in a combination of supplier-specific data that was provided for that specific product. And then they can also include, they use LCA modeling to include data where it doesn't really make sense to put that administrative burden on the supplier. And so the product category rules that help create guide the creation of an EPD, it enables a manufacturer to provide the data that a buyer wants without having to have every single little data point, which gets us to a place where we can make decisions based on embodied carbon footprint without being held back by having every single supplier provide 100% of their data, which can slow things down. And that's always been the ongoing battle of perfect transparency. So with that note, I think I just wanted to end on the sort of like 5, getting started, thinking about building a corporate policy. So establishing an embodied carbon baseline, figuring out what those materials are to get started for whatever your company is, or what kind of buildings you're building or using, setting targets, establishing building and material carbon requirements and integrating them into project documents, and then being sure to work with project teams and suppliers, which I know we're going to hear about more from Katie and Stacy. So I think on that note, I'm going to pass it over. This is the Carbon Leadership Forum Network. You can stay connected and learn more about our resources by joining. And with that, Stacy, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Megan. And I think I have control. I'm just going to try to advance my slides. Yeah. Okay, so Megan, thanks for that intro. And I think your point about perfect transparency. So I'm going to talk about building transparency, which is the name of the nonprofit that is now the home of the EC3 tool. So just diving right in, because I know that we want to get through content to get to questions. This is what Megan was talking about, just in terms of the fact that we now understand the impacts of how much we're building over the next 30 plus years, and that embodied carbon impacts are more than half, I think is what we can now say if we're looking at the time value of carbon. What EC3 is trying to do in that ecosystem that Megan mentioned, where it comes to early life cycle assessment, whole building LCA, then moving into procurement, is really fill that procurement gap, where in the past, up until when we launched the tool, there really wasn't an open access way to access product specific embodied carbon data and use it to inform specifications during late design process, and then also impact bid and procurement, and then realize savings of what you actually built. So we do think that there's a process where you start with whole building LCA, then you move to procurement and EC3. And if you do both of those things together, you can actually reduce your embodied carbon across all of those mechanisms. So EC3 is a free, open access, transparent, easy to use, industry-led, supply chain focused calculator. And these are really the parameters that were set up during its incubation phase to ensure that it would be available for everyone to use and stay an industry-led tool. This is just a snapshot of who's funded the tool up until 2021. We have more pilot partners coming on board, but just to show again, prove that kind of industry-led aspect of it, all of the features of the tool are informed by our pilot partners and our users through being able to give us feedback and make the tool better. Just a little bit about building transparency. We are a new nonprofit. It is founded on the premise of maintaining and scaling the EC3 tool, but we're also looking at other ways to really enable broad and swift action on embodied carbon through more open access tools and data initiatives. And this is our board, which are a lot of folks that I think are REBA members or participants in the corporate space. Looking at our partners and sponsors in 2020 and 2021 through the nonprofit, we can continue to have support from across the AEC industry, as well as philanthropy through Gates Ventures, and from the owner side with support and participation from Microsoft and Google and some others. I'm just going to skip these slides. We're working on a whole bunch of stuff, but I want to get to the action part today based on time. And that's really focusing on how EC3 is used. So EC3 is basically looking at things through the lens of how you take quantity data like you would for cost estimating. And instead of having a cost per unit of material, you have a carbon content per unit of material that we're getting out of those environmental product declarations that Megan mentioned. So we're getting that kilogram of CO2 or global warming potential number per unit of material that we can then multiply against the material quantities. So our kind of core of the tool is the EPD database with a user interface to allow you to search and compare, but also then build up a building to get to an estimate that would allow reduction targets to be set for your supply chain carbon emissions. And this is just my slide of my analogy of EPDs. They typically are PDF documents that are multi-page, but somewhere in that PDF, there's this table that's very much like a nutrition label where it's got a declared unit and a kilogram per unit. And that's really what we are digitizing and pulling into the EC3 tool so that everyone out there doesn't have to go source PDFs and find this information themselves. We get our quantities from either construction estimates where contractors are providing this data into the tool. There's also an integration with Tally where you can actually export your LCA quantities from your REBA model into EC3 to work on the procurement phase. And there's a BIM 360 plugin if you're going to just pull quantities directly from Autodesk software. We're currently also working on a REBA plugin that would allow that to happen automatically too. And I think just to also put a point on what Megan said, I really feel like we're at a tipping point when it comes to embodied carbon, having worked on this for a while now, where we are now in this place where we're past the point of no return. We have to work on it. People are picking up knowledge about it, and we really just need to solve what we're talking about today, which is what you do and the process you take to capitalize on embodied carbon reductions. EC3 has been growing exponentially, so our current user base is almost 12,000. I have to update this slide every time I give a presentation, which is exciting. So this is a curve that we don't want to flatten in the time of COVID, but this is also just a snapshot of where our user base is, and it definitely is not just one part of the AEC or owner community. It's really kind of encompassing everybody, and that's what we hope, is that this is something that gets put into process at various phases and by various people in the project life. So the way the EC3 tool works, usually I do a live demo, but that would take some time. So this is just going to be screenshots today. But there are current EPDs in the tool that you can look at across a whole bunch of product categories. There are 9 public categories and then a swath of pilot categories we're currently populating and developing that will be released to the public. Resilient flooring is coming very soon. On just another tipping point, let's go through these very quickly, but this is just the growth of EPDs in the tool over us starting working on it to September of last year when we pulled the data. So you can see how this number of EPDs is growing exponentially over time. And then when we get into how people are using the tool, this is just the searches over the past 12 months of almost 50,000 searches of the concrete category, and then getting down into the tens of thousands for some of the other categories. So just good to show that people are already using this data and accessing it. We want that to grow to really incentivize market demand. So the way the tool works is that you can go into just the find and compare materials function. You can search to your material that you're hoping to search and filter for. It says ready mix concrete. You can put in filters for state or country or region to get data for suppliers in your area. For concrete, that's important. When you click search, it's going to return all of the samples of product or mix specific EPDs in the database that we digitized. It's also going to give you the box plot where you can start to see the range of that data to set limits and look at reductions. So if I blow that up, what we've done is set a baseline with the Carbon Leadership Forum. That's a high conservative baseline to incentivize disclosure and set a line in the sand for reduction potential. And then you'll see that the data is really giving you a range of the highest and the lowest numbers in that kilogram of CO2 per unit declared, and then a range of the 20th to the 80th in that green rectangle. So the crux of the data from the suppliers is really in that green bar when you're starting to look at things directionally. We call the above the 80 and below the 20 the outliers, so maybe very kind of unique products or mixes. What that enables you to do is once you do your search, you can click the compare button above the manufacturer column, and that's going to give you a comparison of the manufacturers with EPDs in the tool. It will tell you how many they have for the products that you filtered for, and then it will tell you kind of directionally how they're performing. So if you can imagine drawing a line across here, if you were trying to set a limit or a target, you could start to see how what that would mean for the large amounts of data from each of the suppliers. This also potentially let you set a reduction target against a baseline or a starting point. This is showing you that 2 of the suppliers in the Washington market are optimizing their mixes in general more than the third currently. And the idea is, again, with baselines and all this data, that those green bars will continually get lower as we start to request lower carbon products and we start to incentivize that, just like ASHRAE has baselines and reductions that get bigger or lower over time. So we need to apply that same thinking to how we're reducing carbon of the supply chain. You can also do things like get very specific, where you can actually go to a manufacturer and a plant in the tool. We have all of that data captured, and then actually compare things like mixes or different products. So for mixes, it's 3 mix designs that meet your performance criteria. For something like carpet, it could be 4 products from 3 manufacturers that you want to compare next to each other. And then it will pull up a comparison of those things that you've selected at the product level with some uncertainty bars around them. That middle line is the declared number. We assess uncertainty for things like Meghan mentioned. Is that EPD manufacturer specific, plant specific, or product specific? And then that supply chain specific is getting into the downstream data. So you can imagine for cement, there are now EPDs where we have a 88 to 90% supply chain specific number, which gets that blue squishy stuff down to almost nothing because we have cement plant specific data for the concrete EPDs. So a lot of details on this, but really it's about transparency and being able to use the data and push more transparency in the data as we are using it. On the plan and compare building side, this is where you can actually use that quantity data against those searches to get those ranges of potential supply chain emissions. This is where you can see that it's just putting in the different descriptions of the material, the quantities that you have, and then you're doing those search collections specific to your project in the project planner. There you can see I put in a 100-mile radius for a 5,000 PSI mix, and I've used that collection to give me my supply chain reduction potential for concrete. It's going to roll it up into conservative, achievable, and realized embodied carbon intensity. The realized defaults to the high conservative until you've picked your EPDs and selected what you've actually used. You're then able to view summaries like a Sankey diagram, where it's going to show you the relative impacts of each category of material and the potential supply chain reduction. So if you're looking at, ready mix concrete versus your rebar, if you're looking for what place to start for this project, you might just focus on concrete and try to get to that that lower, get to the bottom of that white bar at the 20th percentile of all the supply chain. But that does roll up to an actual project target where you can start to see, based on the supply chain, what reductions might be possible today. You can also then select your EPD. So this is after you've gone through the process, you've selected your EPD, you've updated that in the tool, and then you can actually look at what you've achieved. So this is looking at a baseline. The green's the achievable 20th percentile, and I of course made this one look really good. So we're overachieving on the realized savings in the yellow, but you're able to track that per material category. And this maps directly to the lead pilot credit for procurement that's currently in the lead rating system. And then just the last thing, my simple steps for where you can start. If a manufacturer or product doesn't have an EPD, ask for one. If they do have an EPD, specify them and use them to set baseline basis of design or limits. And then make sure that request makes it into the bid documents with your contractors. That's really where we need to have it for owners to be able to look at bid leveling of cost and carbon. Then once you've done that in the bid documents, ask your contractors to add it to bid leveling so that you can look at potential carbon savings next to cost. We're finding on many projects that for things like concrete, there may be the lowest carbon emitter is the lowest cost bidder, which is exciting. For other categories, there may be small premiums, but when you have that information, you can use it to make good choices with carbon in mind. And then of course, after you've done that, track the savings in EC3 by selecting your EPDs to get those results that you can then use for benchmarking. And then my last point is that there is a whole bunch of folks that are looking at supply chain specific carbon as part of their zero carbon commitment. So this is happening. I want to give Katie time to talk about that specifically for Microsoft, but we are also seeing, again, these policies actually referencing EC3 as a source for the EPD data. And then again, these 4 steps: require EPDs, utilize a free database, set targets, and require projects teams to submit is really what we're seeing across certification systems and policies currently. With that, I will stop. I'm more than happy to do a much longer demo when we have more time, but I'll hand it over to Katie to talk about what Microsoft is doing with this.
Great, thanks, Stacy. I'm going to request control here. Well, thank you everyone for having me today. As mentioned, my name is Katie Ross, and I lead Microsoft's real estate sustainability practice. Just for context setting, in Microsoft's real estate, we have around 32 million square feet globally in our office portfolio. About 14 million of that lives in the Puget Sound region. And I wanted to start today with sort of talking about Microsoft's commitment to sustainability. You probably have seen many of the commitments we've made over the past year. Sustainability is core to our business. It's embedded in everything we do. And we really do believe technology has an incredible space to play in really meeting the global challenges that we're facing with respect to climate. In the last year, we've committed to becoming a carbon negative, water positive, zero waste company by 2030, which is building a planetary computer to help manage and measure the Earth's natural resources. This was as part of sort of a recognition within Microsoft to say we've been a carbon neutral company since 2012. We implemented one of the first carbon taxes internally and have had that in place since 2012 and charge ourselves a $15 tax per metric ton of carbon that each of our business groups emits. But what we realized in the last year is we have the opportunity, but also quite honestly, the responsibility to do more. And those companies who can do more need to do more and step up. And so this was really our next moonshot of what it will take for us to think about sustainability, meet our responsibilities, and how we not only do that within our 4 walls, but also support the industry and the rest of the world at large to say, we have the resources to invest in these areas, and we're going to go and figure out some things and hopefully make it easier for others to do that and have it scale. Megan brought up this point at the beginning, and I think it's really well taken. One of our first findings was we all need to become, I like to call it the dark arts of carbon math. Everyone needs to become far more familiar with how carbon emissions is accounted for. The scope 3 carbon emissions, which I talked about us being a carbon neutral company, that was really for our scope 1 and 2 and business travel. We didn't necessarily account for previously our scope 3 emissions. And when we started looking at the math, we realized it's an outsized portion of our total carbon emissions globally. And that's when you include, the energy to run our data centers. So that was a huge lesson learned for us. And when we committed to carbon negative, one of the ways that we're going to get there is to reduce our scope 3 carbon emissions by over 55% by 2030. That's part of how we get to that zero number, or negative number rather. So as we started learning more and more about scope 3 carbon emissions and started playing this out within our business groups to figure out, where do we have the biggest impact? As I mentioned, I run our real estate team, and so we are doing some fairly large development work, and really started thinking in earnest about how we get to zero from a real estate perspective or from a building perspective. Our biggest development right now is in our headquarters. We call it the Campus Modernization Project. It's a 3 million square foot development of 17 buildings on our existing 500-acre campus. And in redeveloping that building, we knew we wanted to sort of emulate that zero carbon or carbon negative idea. So we had to solve both sides of the equation. We had to solve the operational carbon side, which is historically what we've all been focused on. We've all been focused on energy efficiency, first and foremost, sourcing renewable energy. Increasingly now we're seeing us pulling out fossil fuels. This was not the simplest component to think through, particularly, energy efficiency. We set an EUI target for all of our buildings at the beginning of the project. That was crucial, especially as you get through value engineering and thinking about tons of different components. For us, we have a lot of really innovative digital components that get added to our buildings, but all of those things tend to use energy. So keeping ourselves honest on an energy budget was crucial for us to manage that performance. We source 100% renewable energy for our campus already, so kind of checked the box there, and that was great. And then a big decision for us was to not pull in fossil fuels at all for this development. So we'll be a fully electric central utility plant with geothermal. And the biggest one that we've been sort of navigating is 100% electric cooking facilities. So we will serve over 10,000 meals a day at Microsoft electrically. So we've been learning a lot about induction cooking, at different types of electric cooking practices, in some cases working with manufacturers to actually help invent and develop induction woks and all sorts of crazy things. So we've learned a ton in that space, and that was a huge commitment. So on the operational carbon side, we felt fairly confident that we're meeting that zero equation. On the embodied carbon side, there are historic things that we have done for quite some time. So designing for flexibility has always been built into our workplace designs. We have a really phenomenal campus that has a beautiful sort of forest-like feel to it. So preserving as much as possible. We did evaluate keeping the original 7 buildings that were the structures that existed from an embodied carbon perspective, but unfortunately they did not work for many, many reasons. So the next best thing was really to think about embodied carbon reduction. Stacy and Skanska came to sort of pitch us on being one of the general contractors for the project, and brought this to us to say, we'd really like to help track embodied carbon and reductions and use this EC3 tool to do that. And Microsoft, we make data-driven decisions. We're really interested in transparency of data and having all those things at our fingertips to make smarter decisions. So that really was a no-brainer for us. So we were one of the founding funders and set at the very beginning of the project a 30% reduction in embodied carbon for the projects. And quite honestly, that was probably before we fully understood how we would do that. But we knew that it was possible, right? We knew that based on the studies that CLF had done, that a 30% reduction was reasonable, and really it was going to be quite a task to just operationalize that within the project, which is a lot of what we've been learning. And then in line with our carbon negative commitments, we will be removing from the atmosphere the amount of carbon that we don't reduce. So we will get to zero carbon and are intending to achieve zero carbon certification with ILFI to sort of third-party validate those results. So how does EC3 work, and how does it work within our project? So Stacy highlighted, you know, one of the biggest components for us in using EC3 at the beginning of the project was to make sure that we could make data-driven decisions, especially around prioritization. So from the beginning of the project, we knew that there were a handful of crucial decisions that we make at the very beginning of the project, which really enable us to get that 30% reduction. So looking at concrete and steel and wood, making sure that those things were maximizing to the greatest extent possible the carbon reductions. Because once you get further down the line, while there are components within our TI that have carbon impacts, it'll be hard to sort of make up the ground lost if we don't make some of those smart decisions at the very beginning. So that was a huge lesson learned for us. And I would recommend that that is part of anyone's new process, is making sure you have a lot of clarity for the decision makers on each of those building materials at the very beginning to say, you know, these four are the ones that are the most important to think about. And then these other ones are also important, but, you know, when you start looking at cost premiums, you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck if you make a smarter carbon decision with concrete than you will for, you know, ceiling tile, as an example. So that helped us a lot in sort of prioritization. You saw this slide on Stacy's as well. We also sort of wanted, within all of our bids and our general contractors, when they give us different options, they put the carbon number next to the cost number. So we can see, in this case, supplier A had the largest carbon reductions and also had no cost premium. And so we were able to say, no brainer, we'll pick supplier A because all things equal, it has the largest carbon reduction. And had we not used EC3 or had any of the EPD decisions, we wouldn't have necessarily had that decision point to say supplier A over supplier B, because all other things were equal. So it's been a huge game changer for us to be able to see there are some of these things that have no cost premium. There are, I don't want to sort of paint too rosy a picture, there are certainly things that are cost premiums, and that can be weighed in other decisions that you make within the project. But really, it's been a game changer for us just to have the information as we're making these decisions, particularly with the scale of our project. It's 17 buildings, 5 architects, 3 different general contractors, and the appropriate amount of subcontractors for that scale of a project. So data in the right hands at the right time has been crucial, and the tool has been really easy for us to use and leverage to make those data-driven decisions. Our Silicon Valley campus is another campus where we focused on embodied carbon and carbon reductions. This campus opens this year. It's located in Mountain View. On this campus, the original site had 5 buildings, and we actually made the decision to keep 2 of the original structures and to build the rest of the building around those 2 original structures, which was we were able to greatly reduce the embodied carbon on the building, even when you consider the structural improvements that we needed to make those 2 buildings sort of work within the broader context. So that was a huge win for us. We also decided to use mass timber for this project. So it is, as far as we know, the largest mass timber project in the US. We sourced FSC certified timber from British Columbia, and it is the main structural component. It is a hybrid system, so I think a lot of people have questions about like, well, I can't necessarily build only with wood. You know, I think what is great about EC3 and the conversation we're having around embodied carbon reductions and just general data transparency on embodied carbon is you and Megan brought this up as well. You want to pick the right material and the lowest carbon option for the materials that make sense for your structure. And so that's been a huge win for us as well. Same approach to both sides of the equation. So on operational carbon, set a really low performance target. Also all electric systems, though we do have natural gas for cooking, and the buildings are all powered with 100% renewable energy. So another great sort of case study, and everyone loves beautiful construction pictures. It looks much nicer than this. This is from, I think, 6 months ago, 8 months ago now. But I mean, mass timber was it is stunning to see in person. Every time I go, it's kind of mesmerizing, and really was a great case study for us. And you know, using data to make those decisions and drive carbon reduction on our projects. So I'll just close. And Megan talked a lot about this. I think the thing that we're really excited about from the policy perspective is continuing to drive data transparency, the open source and free access. That was one of the biggest things for us when we started deciding about funding EC3 was, you know, it's great for tech companies to be able to say, yes, we can go and do all these fancy things. But if it can't scale to every developer and every development, Stacy called out that we will be building the equivalent of one New York City every 30 days for the next 35 years. Like if we can't have everyone involved in that, using tools, having access to this data, we're really not going to solve the problem that we need to. And so that's a huge reason why we're such big proponents of EC3 and have been one of the founding funders and continue to use it on all of our projects, is really to make sure that it scales. And we're really excited about the opportunity for this to become, you know, if we think about EUI targets or operational EUI, building code standards, if embodied carbon is increasingly a majority of the carbon emissions in the built space, we should have an embodied carbon intensity target in the same way that we have an EUI target in building codes. So that's another area that we're really excited about, and it seems like there's been a lot of momentum in that space. So we're excited to keep advocating for that and partnering with everyone on pushing this forward. But appreciate your time today, and I'll hand it back over to REBA and see if there are any questions.
Great, thank you all. And I've seen that we've had a number of questions come in via the Q&A function, and that our speakers have been able to answer them live. But if there are any other burning questions that people have been holding close to the vest, maybe now we can take just a few minutes that we have remaining to answer them. So a couple that I see coming in, how does mass timber affect EUI versus concrete from a thermal mass perspective? Does anybody want to take that one?
That is not my area of expertise. I have not heard, since sitting in all of our design meetings, I have not heard that being brought up as a concern. However, I don't sit in every meeting, so not my area of expertise, unfortunately.
One thing I would say is I think that gets to the point where we're seeing a lot of energy modeling tools wanting to pull in embodied carbon data so that you could do both at the same time. And that's one of the things that we're trying to help fill a gap in, is some data sets that would allow those tools to pull in good emissions factors for whole whole life carbon of materials. So I think you'll see more of that coming through tools that are really trying to quantify both for the early design phases from both an energy and a embodied carbon perspective.
Thank you. Next we have, does the EC3 tool show other environmental or social impact categories beyond global warming potential?
So not currently, but we do have an initiative this year called Open EPD that's going to create a digital standard for EPDs that would move us to including all environmental impact categories as well as life cycle stages if they're available in the EPD. So that's coming within the tool. We're working on it right now for the existing database, adding in those impacts. Outside of environmental impacts that are captured in EPDs to date, the API for the data within EC3 that's digitized can be pulled in to other tools that are looking at a broader scope of factors. So things like mindful materials or the transparency catalog, where they can pull in, and we have partnerships with them to pull in our EPD data. We really are trying to do this one thing really well because it is complicated and there's a lot to do. But again, the Open API allows anyone else to use that and pull that into other databases doing more.
Great. Let's see, are there criteria to ensure that all the EPDs uploaded to EC3 tool are verified by a third party?
Yes, so we only accept third-party verified EPDs that meet ISO and EN standards currently. That Open EPD project I talked about will enable program operators to digitally confirm the digital version of the EPD, either by going back and retroactively doing that to date, or for new EPDs, basically just pushing a digital version to the tool with their verification attached.
Then I think our last question, who are the primary users of the EC3 tool today in relation to where they lie in the building material supply chain?
So I showed that pie chart, and it really is a mix. I think about 30% is architecture, and then sustainability consulting, and then construction, and then owners, and then manufacturers, and then researchers. So it really is a swath, and our pilot partners include folks from all of those different buckets. So it can be used in different ways by different members of the AEC community and sector. But I would say, just coming from construction, that I think one of the key ones we have to be engaged is the contractor, because they're the ones actually with the material quantities and the procured materials at the end of the day. So whoever starts the process, I think the contractor is a key component when it comes to the actual procurement and verification of what was installed in the tool.
Well, we have just a couple minutes here. I do want to thank you all again for joining us and sharing your expertise and insight with the crowd. I wanted to also offer if there are any kind of calls to action. I know there have been some kind of sprinkled throughout your presentations, but if there's any specific thing that folks can get engaged with today, tomorrow, sometime in the near term.
So I can send links. I forgot to do this, Jen, but we have, there's a letter being circulated by ULI. If you go to their website, you might be able to access it, or I can provide a link to be shared with attendees. That's just a request letter for EPDs with all the information about what kind, and then a request that they would populate mindful materials in EC3. We are starting an Owners Carbon Action Network group that kicked off yesterday. That's open to anyone that would like to join under the Building Transparency nonprofit. I think we had 18 participants yesterday, and that's really a place to really align on the asks around embodied carbon and what owners can do together to make sure that they're asking their AEC partners the same thing versus 20 versions of the thing. So if you're interested in that, just email me. Anything, Katie or Megan?
Yeah, I was going to say, we're really excited about the Owners Can initiative, because having the combined ask, if you're interested in just a broader sort of community around embodied carbon, the Carbon Leadership Forum community has local hubs in different cities, as well as a global community. There's a sort of online platform, and you can find that by going to our website, and I can send a link via Jen as well, if that's easier. I can put it in the chat, but it's basically carbonleadershipforum.com/community.
Great. Yeah, and we will follow up with an email to all participants with some of these links and contact info and so forth. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. I also want to put a quick plug in. The DISCI program does have our 4th workshop coming up in about a month on March 24th, where we'll be aligning on a final focus area for that program. There's 3 remaining, one of which is building materials. We're also looking at aluminum and solar photovoltaics. So if you have an interest in any of those spaces, please join us and weigh in on where we go next. Great, thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.